When his daughter-in-law called him a burden, nobody imagined that the same old man would one day become the mastermind behind a $50 million success story. This is a powerful story of respect, experience, and silent revenge. The winter mornings in Chicago always felt colder when a person carried loneliness in his heart. That morning, I sat quietly at the small kitchen table in my son's apartment, holding a warm cup of coffee between my trembling hands while heavy snow fell outside the window. The streets below were covered in white, and the sound of the cold wind hitting the glass made the apartment feel even quieter. I stared outside for a long time, lost in my thoughts, wondering how life could change so much in just a few years. There was a time when people waited for my advice, respected my opinions, and appreciated my hard work. Now, even inside my own son's home, I felt invisible. I lived with my son James, his wife Amy, and their little daughter Sophie. The apartment was beautiful, modern, and always full of noise. But despite all of that, I often felt like I did not belong there anymore. James stayed busy with work from morning until late at night, and Amy hardly spoke to me unless it was necessary. At first, I tried to ignore the distance between us. I told myself they were simply stressed because of their financial struggles and new business problems. But deep inside, I knew something had changed. The warmth that once existed in our family was slowly disappearing. Every morning followed the same routine. I would wake up before everyone else, make my coffee, and sit quietly in the kitchen while the rest of the apartment slept. Sometimes I looked through old photographs on my phone, pictures from my younger days when I worked as a chief engineer for one of the largest construction companies in Illinois. Those were proud years of my life. I had spent decades designing buildings, supervising massive projects, and solving problems that seemed impossible to others. Back then, my experience mattered. People respected me. My work gave me purpose, but retirement changes many things. Once people stop needing your skills, they slowly stop noticing your presence too. Amy's behavior toward me became colder with every passing week. She rarely smiled at me anymore. If I tried to start a conversation during dinner, she answered with short, distracted replies before returning to her phone. Sometimes I caught her looking annoyed simply because I was sitting in the living room while she worked on her laptop nearby. Little moments like that hurt more than I wanted to admit. One evening, after dinner, I quietly walked toward the kitchen to pour myself another cup of tea. As I passed near the hallway, I heard James and Amy talking in the living room. Their voices were low at first, but then Amy spoke words that froze me in place. "Your father is completely useless now," she said with frustration in her voice. "He doesn't do anything. He's just a burden on us." For a second, I could not breathe. My hand tightened around the cup as those words echoed inside my mind again and again. Burden. Useless? The same hands that had worked their entire life to build a future for my family were now being described as worthless. I stood there silently, afraid that if I moved, they would realize I had heard everything. James did not answer immediately, and somehow that silence hurt even more than Amy's words. I slowly turned around and walked back to my room without making a sound, carrying a pain in my chest heavier than anything I had ever lifted in my entire life. That night, I sat alone in my room for hours, unable to sleep. The city lights outside my window blurred behind my tired eyes as Amy's words repeated endlessly in my mind. Yes, just a burden on us. No matter how hard I tried to ignore them, they cut deeper every single time. I had faced difficult moments before in my life, financial struggles, stressful projects, impossible deadlines, but nothing had ever hurt me like hearing that from my own family. The silence in the apartment felt heavy, almost suffocating. I could hear faint laughter from the living room, the sound of the television, and little Sophie running around happily, but somehow I felt completely separated from all of it. For the first time in many years, I questioned my own worth. I looked down at my old hands, rough from decades of work, and remembered the countless sacrifices I had made for my family. There were years when I barely slept because I worked overtime to give James a better future. I still remembered standing 4 hours at construction sites during freezing Illinois winters, checking blueprints under pouring rain, solving emergencies in the middle of the night, and carrying responsibilities that affected hundreds of workers. Back then, people trusted my judgment. My experience meant something. Now, it felt like none of it mattered anymore. But as painful as Amy's words were, something inside me refused to break. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. The wrinkles on my face had deepened over the years, and my hair had turned completely white. But behind those tired eyes was still the same man who had once built impossible things from nothing. Age had slowed my steps, but it had not erased my knowledge. It had not erased my ability to think, create, and solve problems. At breakfast, James looked exhausted as he scrolled through numbers on his tablet. His new business was struggling badly, and I could see the pressure on his face growing every day. Amy looked stressed too, constantly talking about bills, investors, and equipment costs. They were trying to expand their manufacturing business, but the machinery they needed was far too expensive. Every solution seemed out of reach. I stayed quiet during breakfast, but my mind was already working later that afternoon. I opened an old storage box hidden in my closet. Inside were my engineering notebooks, old sketches, technical designs, and project files from my years in construction and manufacturing. Dust covered most of them, but as I flipped through the pages, memories came rushing back. Complicated systems, innovative designs, solutions that once saved companies millions of dollars, was all still there. And suddenly, for the first time in months, I felt something I had almost forgotten: purpose. That same evening, I made a decision. Instead of sitting quietly and accepting humiliation, I would prove that experience never loses its value. I would show them that wisdom built over decades could still change lives. But I didn't want sympathy, and I didn't want arguments inside the house. I wanted results. The following day, I contacted an old friend named Walter, who owned a small workshop on the south side of Chicago. We had worked together years ago on several industrial projects before retirement pulled us in different directions. When he heard my voice on the phone, he sounded genuinely happy. "Frank, it's been years. What made you call me all of a sudden?" I smiled faintly and looked down at the old engineering sketches spread across my desk. "I think I still have one more project left in me." The next morning, I left the apartment quietly before anyone woke up. The cold Chicago wind hit my face the moment I stepped outside, but for the first time in a long while, I felt alive. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders and walked slowly toward the train station, carrying a small leather bag filled with old notebooks, pencils, and folded engineering sketches. Snow covered the sidewalks, and the city looked gray and frozen, but inside me, something had started moving again. Walter's workshop was located in an old industrial area on the south side of Chicago, surrounded by worn-out warehouses and rusted metal fences. The building itself looked forgotten by time. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the large garage doors groaned loudly whenever they opened. But the moment I stepped inside, the familiar smell of machine oil, metal, and burning steel brought back memories I thought I had lost forever. Walter greeted me with a wide smile and pulled me into a warm hug. He had aged too, his beard had turned gray, and his back bent slightly when he walked, but his energy remained the same. "I knew you wouldn't stay retired forever," he laughed. I smiled quietly and looked around the workshop. Old machines filled every corner, sparks flew from welding tables, and the sound of tools echoed through the building. It wasn't glamorous, but to me, it felt more comforting than the expensive apartment where I lived for the next several days. I began spending all my time there. Every morning, I left before sunrise and returned home late in the evening. James and Amy assumed I was simply taking walks or visiting old friends, and I never corrected them. Part of me wanted to surprise them only when everything was finished. While working at the workshop, I kept thinking about James's struggling business. He and Amy were trying desperately to grow their manufacturing company. But the biggest obstacle standing in their way was the machinery they needed. Modern industrial equipment cost millions of dollars, and every supplier demanded prices they simply could not afford. I had watched James lose sleep over those numbers night after night. That problem became my mission. I spread blueprints across Walter's work table and started designing a completely new system from scratch. I wanted to create a machine that was not only cheaper but also faster, smarter, and easier to maintain than the expensive imported models dominating the market. My years of engineering experience gave me an advantage younger designers often lacked. I understood how to simplify systems without sacrificing quality. For weeks, I worked endlessly. Some nights, Walter and I stayed in the workshop until midnight, surrounded by scattered tools, empty coffee cups, and stacks of technical drawings. My hands often shook from exhaustion, and my eyes burned after hours of calculations. But I refused to stop. Every bolt, every measurement, every moving part had to be perfect. There were moments when frustration nearly defeated me. One evening, after testing an early prototype, the entire motor system overheated within minutes. Smoke filled the workshop, and one of the mechanical arms snapped apart violently, crashing onto the floor. Walter looked at me carefully. "Maybe you're pushing yourself too hard, Frank," but I shook my head immediately. "Gino," I said firmly, "I've solved bigger problems than this my whole life." So I started again. Slowly, the design improved, piece by piece. The machine became exactly what I had imagined. It consumed less power, required fewer materials, and operated almost twice as efficiently as the expensive systems James had been researching online. The day we finally completed the working model, I stood silently in front of it while the machine hummed smoothly inside the workshop. Walter stared at it in disbelief. "Frank," he whispered. "This thing could change an entire industry." I looked at the machine for a long moment, then quietly thought about Amy's words from that night in the apartment. The pain was still there, but now it no longer felt like weakness. It had become fuel pushing me forward with every step. A few days after completing the machine, I finally decided it was time to show James what I had been working on. That evening, he sat at the dining table surrounded by paperwork, financial reports, and unpaid invoices. His face looked exhausted, and dark circles had formed under his eyes from weeks of stress and sleepless nights. Amy sat nearby with her laptop open, quietly discussing another failed deal with a supplier. The atmosphere in the apartment felt tense, heavy with worry and disappointment. I walked slowly toward the table carrying a thick folder filled with blueprints, calculations, and prototype photographs. James barely looked up at first. "Gee, Dad, not now," he sighed tiredly. "I am dealing with too much already," but I calmly placed the folder in front of him. "Just look at it," I said softly. Something in my voice made him pause. He opened the folder carelessly at first, expecting nothing important, but within seconds his expression changed completely. His eyes moved rapidly across the technical drawings while his posture straightened in disbelief. "What is this?" he asked quietly. "Just a solution," I replied. Amy leaned closer, confused by James's sudden reaction. He flipped through the pages faster, studying every detail carefully. The machine design included advanced efficiency systems, lower production costs, and a simplified structure that eliminated several expensive components competitors relied on. Almost unable to believe what he was seeing. "You designed all of this?" I nodded slowly. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then James stood up so suddenly his chair nearly fell backward. He looked at me differently than he had in years, met as an old retired man sitting quietly in the apartment, but as the engineer he once admired when he was younger. "This could save the company," he said. Within days, James arranged meetings with investors and manufacturers to present the design. At first, many people doubted us. Some executives laughed at the idea that a retired engineer had developed something better than modern industrial companies spending millions on research. But the moment they saw the prototype working in Walter's workshop, their attitudes changed instantly. The machine performed beyond expectations. It operated faster, consumed less energy, and reduced production costs dramatically. Word spread quickly through the manufacturing industry, and suddenly companies that had ignored us before were now calling every day asking for demonstrations and contracts. Everything began changing at a speed none of us could fully understand. James's struggling business exploded with success almost overnight. Orders flooded in from across the United States. Factories in Texas, California, and New York began purchasing our systems. Then international companies started contacting us from Germany, Canada, Japan, and South Korea. Within a year, our products were being exported to more than 20 countries around the world. The small office James once feared losing turned into the headquarters of a rapidly growing international company. Employees filled entire floors of new buildings. Warehouses expanded. Production lines operated day and night to keep up with demand, and then came the moment none of us ever imagined. One financial magazine published an article calling our invention the future of affordable industrial manufacturing. After that, investors poured millions into the company. The business value climbed higher and higher until it eventually crossed $50 million. $50 million. Sometimes I sat quietly in my office overlooking downtown Chicago and wondered how life could change so completely from one painful moment. The greatest change, however, was inside our home. Amy no longer ignored me during dinner. Instead, she asked for my opinions before making business decisions. She proudly introduced me to guests, investors, and business partners as the man whose idea transformed the entire company. I could see regret in her eyes whenever she looked at me, though she never directly mentioned the words she had once said, but I remembered them, not with anger anymore, but as a reminder that people often underestimate the quiet strength carried by those who have lived long enough to gather wisdom through pain, sacrifice, and experience. Life inside our home felt completely different after the success of the business. The same apartment that once felt cold and distant now carried warmth again. Conversations returned to the dinner table. Laughter filled the rooms more often, and for the first time in years, I no longer felt invisible. James spoke to me with a level of respect I had deeply missed, and even during business meetings, he proudly introduced me as the man whose experience had changed everything. Sometimes I caught him looking at me with guilt in his eyes, as if he regretted not defending me sooner when I needed him most. But the biggest change came from Amy. The woman who once avoided me now sat beside me for hours asking questions about engineering, business decisions, and life itself. She wanted to know how I solved problems under pressure, how I stayed calm during difficult situations, and how I managed to keep moving forward after hearing words that could have broken any person. At first, her kindness felt unfamiliar to me, almost uncomfortable, because I still remembered those painful words from that night in the living room. Even though I never mentioned them again, they had left scars deep inside my heart. One evening, after everyone had finished dinner, Amy quietly entered my room while I was reading near the window. She looked nervous, holding a small cup of tea in her hands. "Gee, can I sit here for a moment?" "GT?" she asked softly. I nodded. For a few seconds, she stayed silent, staring down at the floor before finally speaking. "Jai was wrong about you," she whispered. "I judged you because of your age, and I forgot everything you had done for this family." There was pain in her voice, but also honesty. "I thought getting older meant becoming weak," she continued. "But now I understand that experience is something priceless." I looked at her quietly for a long moment before smiling faintly. "Jen, people are young," I said gently. "They often think strength only belongs to the fast, the new, and the modern. But real strength comes from surviving life's hardest moments without losing yourself." Tears slowly filled her eyes as she listened. From that day forward, Amy treated me with genuine respect, not because of the money or success the company had achieved, but because she finally understood the value hidden behind years of experience. She started spending more time with me, asking me to tell stories about my younger days, my engineering career, and the struggles I had faced long before she became part of our family. Even little Sophie began sitting beside me every evening, fascinated by my stories about construction sites, giant machines, and snowy winters in old Chicago. As months passed, I realized something important. Success had not healed me because of the millions of dollars or international recognition. What truly healed me was feeling valued again. Every human being, no matter their age, wants to feel that their existence still matters. Too many elderly people spend their final years feeling forgotten inside their own homes. Society often celebrates youth while quietly pushing wisdom into the background. But the truth is, the world people enjoy today was built by hands that are now old and tired. Every road, every building, every opportunity exists because someone before us sacrificed their strength and time to create it. A person never becomes old simply because their hair turns white. A person becomes old only when they stop believing they still have purpose. And that is why we should never treat our elders like burdens. The tree giving you shade today once survived storms, heat, and endless seasons before becoming strong enough to protect others. Experience is not something you can buy, download, or replace with technology. It is a treasure earned slowly through years of struggle, patience, mistakes, sacrifice, and survival. If this story touched your heart, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon so you never miss another emotional and inspiring story. Your support means everything, and maybe the next story will change someone else's life too.